Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. Welcome to Issues and Answers, the minimum wage. I'm Fred Martino. Over the next hour, we'll be discussing one of the most high-profile issues in our region and across the nation. Since the federal minimum wage is not indexed to rise with inflation, states and communities are taking action. And one of those efforts happened right here in Las Cruces. As Executive Director of CAFé, Communities in Action and Faith, Sarah Nolan led the fight to raise the city's minimum wage to $10.10 an hour by 2017. Las Cruces Mayor Pro-Tem and 2nd District Councilor Greg Smith supported an ordinance for a smaller minimum wage increase to $8.50 by 2016. We'll have audience questions for both of them coming up, but first we explore the opinions and facts on the minimum wage with KRWG's Simon Thompson.
This is a vote for mothers and families, and not just money.
There are going to be layoffs. There are going to be shortage of hours. They're going to be cutting workers.
Hard work deserves fair pay. What we have now is not fair. What we have now is not fair pay.
Prices will increase. Not a threat, it's just a simple business practice.
I have yet to hear a business say that they would consider cutting their profits just a little bit.
We pay them what our business can afford and still stay in business.
My job was to prosecute federal defendants, many of whom had found that selling drugs was a better way of providing for their families than working at a minimum wage job.
And this notion, as some here today propose, that greedy business owners have pots of money sitting around somewhere to offset a cost increase is simply naive and ridiculous.
We all stood up a while ago and made a pledge of allegiance. And part of those words were liberty and justice for all. When you see somebody making a profit while their employees are getting starving wages, that is not liberty and that is not justice. I hope that you take that into consideration. The situation is drastically turned against the working people, and it's time we did something about it. You can start right now.
In 1933, when Mr. Roosevelt took his seat.
The minimum wage was established in 1938 at the urging of President Franklin Roosevelt, who sent the bill to Congress with the conviction that America should be able to give, quote, all our able-bodied working men and women a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. In more recent times, the minimum wage has not been increased with inflation, and low-wage workers are frustrated. Harry Kurgans works as a sales associate at Kohl's department store.
To be told that what you're making now is enough, you're not worth any more than that, because it'll affect our profit line. It's not a great feeling.
There's a misconception that most minimum wage workers are teenagers. Kurgans is 62. And the Economic Policy Institute says 88% of workers who would benefit from a federal minimum wage increase to $10.10 an hour are at least 20 years old, and a third of them are at least 40 years old. In the wake of the Great Recession and 5 straight years of falling median US income, an increasing number of low-wage jobs are held by former members of the middle class.
If there is even a middle class anymore, I used to consider myself as a middle class. I don't anymore.
Kurgans hasn't always been a low-wage worker. Before the economy took a turn for the worse, he worked a string of salaried marketing positions between LA and Chicago.
Corporations started cutting their budgets, and the first one that was usually cut was marketing.
Out of work, luck and money, Kurgans had few other options but to move back in with his mom in Las Cruces. He's working part-time.
Having not worked for several years, I was glad to get anything, just to get back in the workforce.
Kurgans earns $8.11 an hour as a sales associate. He says an increase to $10.10 wouldn't solve all his problems, but it would go a long way in raising his standard of living.
I enjoy my work. I work just as hard as if I was making 3 times, 4 times as much. And it's hard to live on minimum wage. Minimum wage doesn't buy what it used to. It's not worth the same anymore.
When the federal government introduced the minimum wage, it was not indexed for inflation. While the cost of living has increased, the minimum wage has lost its value, buying less and less. The last time Kurgans was living at home and working a low-wage job was when he was in high school.
The job I had, I worked for $1.60 an hour. But gas cost, I think, 25 cents a gallon. I think a McDonald's hamburger was 14 or 15 cents. Things are, like I said before, minimum wage just doesn't have it's not worth what it used to be.
According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, $1.60, the 1968 minimum wage, is equivalent to $10.94 in today's money. But some, including Las Cruces Mayor Pro-Tem Greg Smith, say the city cannot withstand such a large increase over the course of a few years. Smith says the wage should be set by what works for the Las Cruces community.
2024, somewhere along in there, would be about the point at which we got to 10.10.
But others argue low-wage workers shouldn't have to wait that long for the pay increase. US Commerce Department data says major employers of low-wage workers are doing well. In 2013, corporate profits were at a 85-year high. New Mexico State University professor of economics Chris Erickson.
And they're working for large corporations that have the capacity to pay higher wages, but are choosing not to.
And that leaves low-wage workers like Harry Kurgans to some extent dependent on federal safety nets like food stamps and Medicaid.
I qualify for Medicaid. I'm not proud of it.
Though Kurgans isn't on food stamps, 1 in 7 Americans are. In New Mexico, the state with the highest rate of child poverty, that figure is 1 in 5. Erickson says that includes people working as many as 40 hours a week. And he argues American taxpayers are effectively subsidizing businesses that pay low wages.
Those workers are able to accept a lower wage because they are receiving these subsidies from the government. And employers who employ minimum wage workers know that, and they adjust the wages they offer their workers accordingly. And so that becomes a subsidy not to the worker, but rather to the employer, because the employer can get away with paying less because of these subsidies their employees are receiving. So by raising the minimum wage, you make the employer pay the true costs of that worker.
Erickson says with a citywide minimum wage increase, the cost of food, goods and services is likely to go up, but not dramatically. And the other result will be a better standard of living for low-wage workers.
It is definitely a redistribution of wealth. It redistributes wealth from employers and from consumers to workers. And these are low-income workers. One could argue that a worker working full-time ought to be able to support themselves, and a higher minimum wage will make it easier for them to be able to do that.
Erickson says smaller and locally owned businesses will have far less capacity to absorb the cost of raising the minimum wage.
Oh, this is what the Lorenzo's bread looks like before.
Vince Vaccaro owns and operates Lorenzo's restaurant in Las Cruces.
I will probably cut my hours, 15 hours a week. I will let at least 4 people go in staff. And prices would definitely go up just to survive, just to keep the restaurant going.
But Erickson says while wage costs will increase, many businesses will recoup that loss through increased spending by low-income workers.
Those low-income workers tend to spend every dollar they receive, and that can increase demand in the economy and can actually lead, in some studies, has led to an increase in employment.
But Erickson notes big businesses may benefit more from that increased spending, and that worries small business owners like Vocaro.
If mom and pops go out of business, we're going to have the homogenized city again with only chain restaurants that the money goes out of the city. I mean, it comes down to economics, but there won't be a flavor of Las Cruces anymore. You know, we'll lose places like La Posta or Double Eagle, things that make Las Cruces when people come here. You know, the Chocolate Lady little candy store around Macias Square. There's so much, and it's community oriented. That's what this is about. And coming in and doing a one-size-fits-all, it's going to really wipe out what Las Cruces is.
Vaccaro says most of Lorenzo's kitchen staff already earn more than the minimum wage, and servers who receive tips often do even better.
A really bad day to a really good day, probably $12 to $50 in an hour. It depends on your servers, how good they are. And my good servers get more than $2.13 an hour. My tipped employees, the majority of them make at least $5.50 an hour and up.
Servers at other restaurants, like the Game in Las Cruces, often command an even higher income.
I'm more of an upscale tip as far as my income. I do nice.
Salvatore Cabanas says he averages about $25 per hour serving tables.
On a Saturday night, I could shoot about $220 for just one shift on the evening itself.
But the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows a very different story for many servers. In 2013, the median wage for waiters and waitresses was less than $9 an hour. Cassie Colway is living this reality. She works part-time on the breakfast and lunch shift at Cracker Barrel and earns about $200 a week. That's less than what Cabanas can make in a 5-hour Saturday shift.
You make $7.50 an hour, a box of cereal is $4, and a gallon of gas is $3.39. You're working 1 hour for that.
When tipped wage workers' base wage and tips combined don't add up to the legal minimum wage, employers are federally mandated to make up the difference. But with 2 daughters at home, still in high school, Colway says she's still struggling to put food on the table or keep the car she drives to work running.
I always say that there's a difference between survival and living, and I feel like my wage allows me to survive. I have a roof over my head and I have food, but I also have food stamps.
Colway gets $300 a month in government assistance for each of her daughters. Combined with her earnings, she says they live off between $900 and $1,600 a month. Even in a good month, that leaves the single-income family living just below the poverty line. Marcy Dickerson owns the Game and a number of restaurants in Las Cruces. She says even her top-tier servers like Cabanas made a lot less when they were first hired.
When you do not have a marketable skill, then you're kind of where you're at. Hone your craft and go get a better job. And that's kind of it. It's a free market opportunity. Go forth and get a better job. If you don't want to dig ditches, or do that for a living, then go hone your craft, develop some skills that make you more marketable and worth more money.
In Oregon and California, workers collect tips on top of the regular state minimum wage. In California, that's $9 an hour. In Oregon, it's $9.10 an hour. Tipped wage workers with earnings that far exceed the minimum wage often work nights and at establishments that serve alcohol. As a mother of 2 kids still in high school, Colway says she can't justify leaving her 2 daughters alone at night.
Sometimes it's a double-edged sword because people will say, get a better job, work different hours, or you have people who work 2 jobs, 2 minimum wage jobs, and then people want to complain when there's kids who get into trouble and who aren't at home, who are home alone. So I sacrifice making more money, working different hours, because I want to be here. If I weren't here, Cassidy couldn't get to soccer practice. Caitlin couldn't get to Navigator Scouts because there would be nobody else to drive them. I don't want to leave Cassidy here responsible every night for making sure that Caitlin gets a bath and gets her homework done. And, because this is not their fault.
the problem of your children not getting the kind of care they need, and that can have social consequences later on that can be quite substantial. And by the way, I'd add that those can be translated into not just social costs, but also economic costs.
Corway says her work situation is likely to improve once she finishes a master's degree, as she's working on. But that won't be for another 3 years. She says in the meantime, a minimum wage increase would really help.
It's embarrassing to be in the situation that you're in. I mean, I don't ever volunteer to take anybody's kid anywhere because I don't want to be broken down with my own, let alone somebody else's, you know. Carpools. I don't go to out-of-town games because I don't go out at night because I don't have a headlight. I don't, you know, all those things that require me to have extra money that I don't have money for.
Sarah Nolan is the Executive Director of Communities in Action and Faith, or CAFé. She says political gridlock has left Las Cruces families like the Corways facing poverty.
Governments were in such gridlock that no one was really governing.
And so began CAFé's push to raise the Las Cruces minimum wage to $10.10 by 2017. City Councillor Miguel Silva proposed a much smaller increase. The council passed the ordinance he proposed to increase the minimum wage to $8.50 by 2016 and index it to the cost of living thereafter. Silva says the CAFé proposal would make Las Cruces less competitive and less attractive to new business.
What we have to do is find what's reasonable for this community. I support raising minimum wage, but I support what's reasonable for this community, and it looks like, and again through my conversations, through the research, that $8.50 is a number that's reasonable for Las Cruces.
Division over the minimum wage runs even deeper at a federal level. Take this campaign ad for Democratic Senator Tom Udall featuring taped audio of Republican challenger Alan Way. Way proposed eliminating the minimum wage for people under 26.
Remember your first real job? Here's what multi-millionaire Alan Way thinks you're worth.
No minimum wage below the age of 27. So what if they're making $4 an hour? So what?
Way says his proposal was aimed at youth unemployment. New Mexico Senator Martin Heinrich is co-sponsoring the Fair Minimum Wage Act, a bill to raise the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour over 3 years. But he says pressure from communities throughout the country might be the best way to get the federal government moving on the issue.
Sometimes the leaders follow the people, and this is one of those cases.
What do we want? Fair wages. When? Now.
Las Cruces, like many cities, has a ballot initiative, a democratic mechanism enshrined in the city charter.
We have the benefit of having this extra democratic tool that says, you know, if the city government isn't doing what we think it should for the best and the common good of its people, that the citizens can petition their own city. And so we used it for the first time in, we think, about 20 years.
The process allows ordinances to be placed in front of the City Council for a yes or no vote, following signatures of support from at least 10% of registered city voters.
At the time we had 5 staff, five paid staff, and 100, almost 200 volunteers, just cycling in and out of our office day to day in those 30 days that we were collecting signatures.
Retiree and Las Cruces resident Jane Ash was one of the volunteers. She collected about 100 signatures at grocery stores, shopping centres and different churches every Sunday.
I, as an individual, wore my shoes out and my legs.
Even though Ash doesn't earn the minimum wage or depend on anybody who does, she says working to engage her community and improve the quality of life in Las Cruces is a civil responsibility.
I think this issue is much bigger than minimum wage. It has to do with being in touch with citizens and those issues that are important to the well-being of the community.
Within the space of 30 days, CAFé says they collected more than 6,000 signatures of support for raising the minimum wage to $10.10 by 2017. Once the required amount of signatures were validated by the city clerk, the ordinance was brought to the city council for a vote with 2 choices: enact the ordinance as it's written without amendments, or reject it and let it go to the ballot for a vote by the people. But neither of those 2 things happened. while the council voted 4-3 to enact the ordinance stopping it from going onto the ballot. The mayor and the councillors that voted for it said they were in fact against it. They went on to detail their plans and power to change the terms of the very ordinance their vote just brought into law.
They wanted to keep power in the city hall chambers and keep it out of the ballot and keep it out of the hands of voters, especially working class and low income voters, because they want to keep the power. This is about power.
According to the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, US voters have not rejected a minimum wage hike at the ballot since 1996. Since then, many wage hikes have been approved, and City Councillor Nathan Small says Las Cruces should have had their chance to vote as well.
It seemed to me like a way specifically designed to exclude people from the process, to have less public involvement.
And people may continue to feel excluded if changes are made to the ordinance. But Las Cruces City Manager Robert Garza says vote or no vote, changes to the ordinance are allowed.
And let's say that it went that other route and the voters said, yes, we think you ought to put this ordinance in place. Well, then we have this ordinance in place. It doesn't mean that tomorrow the city council couldn't look at that ordinance and say, can we make it better? Can we make it stronger? Can we change it somehow? Absolutely they can, because they're the legislators of Las Cruces, and that's a piece of legislation. It's their law. They can do with it as they please.
That's led many to question the Las Cruces ballot initiative's capacity to perform its intended democratic function.
This is a red flag for the undermining of democracy.
Then what's the point of a ballot initiative process if anyone can just turn around and gut it? And that's where we are right now.
CAFé wants to make sure the council cannot gut successful initiatives. Raising the minimum wage is only one of the issues CAFé is pushing to change. Paid sick leave could be its next initiative, an idea that has already been adopted in other cities. But Garza says the effectiveness of the initiative cannot be understated. He says CAFé thrust the minimum wage issue into the city's consciousness, forcing the council to consider the issue, and it was arguably the catalyst for the council's minimum wage increase to $8.50 earlier in the year.
Lots of people have maybe woken up to issues and found ways to begin to share their points of view, whether it's pro or con on an issue. I mean, it's created a great community conversation. People have talked about the issue, and I think maybe more so than a lot of other things that have happened in the last decade or longer, it's that significant.
In some states like California, state ballot initiatives cannot be repealed or even amended, not without being sent back to the voters for approval. That's not the case in Las Cruces, but it could be. Garza says that CAFé or any group or residents could petition a similar ballot initiative to amend the city charter and limit council's power to tweak ballot initiative ordinances after yes or no votes. But it would require signatures from at least 15% of registered city voters.
In the case of a charter amendment, it's not a city council vote. It goes directly to the ballot. As long as there's enough signatures, put it on the next ballot or have a special election.
But CAFé is focused on the fight at hand, defending the 1010 minimum wage ordinance. Billboards and voter education are part of that effort, and they also pledged to work on voter turnout for city council elections in 2015.
I think it's not a matter of if we're going to win, it's just when. We're going to win. And I'm just trying to figure out how and when.
The CAFé minimum wage ordinance has raised the tipped base wage in Las Cruces for the first time in 20 years. As a result, Corway says she will be able to provide more opportunities for her two daughters.
I personally know that, I'll never own a brand new car or never own a house of my own, but I'm going to make sure that the girls do. And that's the goal now, is to make it better as we go on, to kind of stop the circle of poverty.
Corway hopes city councillors don't take away her pay rise by changing the ordinance. But ultimately, the issue is about more than dollars and cents. For workers like Harry Kurgans, it's also a question of personal dignity.
I know that I am valuable where I'm at. We're all valuable at what we do. You know, you just feel like I said, you're disposable. If I go away, they'll just hire somebody else.
You're watching Issues and Answers, the minimum wage. Once again, our guests include Sarah Nolan, Executive Director of CAFé, Communities in Action and Faith, and Las Cruces Mayor Pro-Tem Greg Smith. For the rest of our program, we're going to have audience questions. Remember, the questions should be 2 sentences or less so we can get to as many topics as possible. And I'd also like to remind the audience to refrain from clapping or any other noise during our taping today. And we already have someone who's ready to be the brave person with that first step, the first question. Your name and where you're from.
Susan Fitzgerald, I'm from Las Cruces. And my question is, at the council work session a couple of weeks ago, there was discussion about assessing the impact of the new minimum wage. My question for both of you is, how long should the new minimum wage be in effect before it's assessed, and what sorts of metrics should be used to assess it?
Okay, Greg, if you could take that question first about how do we assess the effect of increasing the minimum wage, and how long until you can make an assessment?
It's an excellent question, and thank you, Ms. Fitzgerald, for asking that question. I think some confusion happened at the work session because it was mentioned that we could somehow assess this by taking phone calls and emails. And one of the things that I have been talking with people about is how we get to actually doing a better job of getting those metrics. Basing it on phone calls and emails is far from satisfactory, and I think the time period is also going to be something that's going to have to be up to how we assess in a way that is meaningful to this community. So I would assume that somewhere between 6 months or a year would be a reasonable amount of time to get a sense. Obviously, some things are going to take longer to play out. Other things may happen very quickly. So I would say an ongoing monthly tabulation or survey, something that helps us know this is what we're seeing is happening. As Mr. Garza mentioned in the documentary, the City Council is tasked, it is our obligation to try to look out for this community and to make adjustments to our ordinances, to our laws, as we see that need occurring. So the survey will help us, if we do a survey or some other tabulation to get the data, will help us assess where we are, what's happening, and what needs to be done.
Okay, so a minimum of 6 months is what you're saying.
I would say a minimum of 6 months,
okay.
Yes.
We want to remind our audience that immediately after asking the question, as Susan did, you can sit down to hear the answer. I realize that feels a bit rude perhaps, but that's in order to allow the second person to come up for a question, and we welcome another question right now. As we wait, Sarah, your thoughts on this, about how we assess the effect of the rise that's scheduled to go into effect in January, and how long until you can make an assessment?
Yeah, I think Susan brings up a good question that Councilor Cialavatino mentioned at the work session. We agree. We think that anecdotal data isn't the best way to measure the effect and effectiveness and impact of an increase in the minimum wage. I think one thing that the Office of Management and Budget that City Hall and city staff already do is measuring gross receipts tax. That's a really good measurement of how healthy a city is through GRT growth. New business licenses, I think measuring them at different periods, periods of recession and also periods of growth within the city of Las Cruces. I think it's good to look back at patterns that we can measure. City Manager Garza had also mentioned if there's more trash in a neighborhood, if trash collectors are picking up more trash, that means that neighborhood is doing better because they're consuming more. That's a funny little data point, but it's something that we could also look at over time. But I think if we can really look at utility payments, there's partial payments. I know there's a vast majority of Las Cruces residents that can't pay their full utility bill. You know, could we measure that over time? But we're going to lean very much on the city manager and the Office of Management and Budget and the city treasurer to look at what data they're already collecting that we can be studying.
Okay, very good. We have another question now, and your name and where you're from.
Peter Goodman, Doña Ana County. Many economists believe that increases in the minimum wage tend to help local economies because, as Craig Erickson says, workers can't afford to save so much and they spend everything they get. He put it more cautiously and said that's true in some or many communities. So, twofold question. I'd like to hear from Mr. Smith why he feels Las Cruces would be significantly different from other communities in that regard, and from Ms. Nolan, why she feels Las Cruces would be like other communities in that regard.
Let's see what they feel. Thank you very much, Peter. Sarah, to begin with you on this one, this is something that we've heard not only in Las Cruces, but as the minimum wage has risen in other communities and states around the country, the idea that one benefit perhaps for a community is that there would be more spending. Is this your assessment of what would happen in Las Cruces?
Absolutely. I mean, our city is unlike no other in very many ways, but it's very similar in that when people have more money, they spend it. And that a good way to grow the middle class in any city is to make sure that they have the money to spend and invest in their own communities. We know in the first year alone, $10 million will be created and spent and circulated within Las Cruces just by raising the minimum wage to $8.40 and $3.36 for the tipped wage.
And where does that number come from?
So that's through the Census Department and then through the Department of Labor.
So it's an estimate from Census based on what's happened elsewhere, is what you're saying. Okay. Greg, your thoughts on this in terms of the effect of this. Will that increased spending, in your view, be enough to offset any kind of pain for some local businesses that are paying the higher wages?
Well, thanks. That is a question that I think requires a lot of thought and I think some caution in our local economy and in our local circumstances. What makes us different and sometimes wonderful is our location. We're not far from El Paso, we're not far from the border with Texas, we're not far from the border with Chihuahua, Mexico. That brings many benefits culturally, economically, all kinds of things are happening in that regard. But it also means that when we talk about what we do here, people have easier options sometimes to say, okay, it's too expensive now, I'm going to take it somewhere else. And so that's one of the concerns I have. Another is that when we were talking about raising the minimum wage for a community the size of Las Cruces, we have just over 100,000 people here. And I looked to see if I could find where other cities of our size have done that. Now Santa Fe is smaller, but Santa Fe is such a very different dynamic that I would say, they tout themselves as a city different. And I think that it would be very hard for Las Cruces to say we have the same kind of economy or the same kind of drivers that Santa Fe does.
So you're saying that you looked at places where the minimum wage has gone up and you couldn't find a community that was comparable to Las Cruces in order to gauge what the effect might be.
Essentially that. I couldn't find another city of about 100,000 that actually had its own minimum wage.
Sarah, is that your assessment?
Well, what we know is that in 1998, Washington State, which has very small communities, raised their minimum wage. Right now, Washington State has the highest minimum wage across the country.
But that was a statewide minimum wage.
$9.32.
And of course, this is one of the difficulties in this and why a lot of folks are pushing for a federal minimum wage, kind of what I believe you were alluding to, Greg, that folks can go to another community to purchase items, a community that might not have as high of a minimum wage and perhaps could have lower prices.
Right. I think I would also argue that Las Cruces is the poorest and lowest income per capita city that has raised the minimum wage. So we are unique in that we're the poorest city that has raised its minimum wage in 2014. When you look at economic assessments that UNM did in 2008, community economic assessment, they said one of our biggest barriers to growth was our poverty. And we know that raising the minimum wage to $10.10, when you include the earned income tax credit, lifts a family of 4 out of poverty. We know that through research and through the data that we've collected over the past 18 months that we began our campaign. And so we were extremely intentional about the policy that we rolled out and the policy that we put together through an ordinance. I think that 1010 by 2017 is reasonable for a city of our size, especially looking at the amount of poverty that we and our families are faced with. And many could agree at the time when the 850 June ordinance was passed that 850 was a good amount for us to start with. And starting January, that's going to go up to 840. So it's 10 cents less than what people had to anticipate for the increase that City Council first passed.
Okay. I have another question. Your name and where you're from.
My name is Peter Osorio, and I'm from Doñana County. And my question is more about the process than the substance of the 1010. Normally, I would applaud when city councilors use their best judgment when writing on a blank slate to craft legislation. But doesn't the fact that by its votes, the council essentially accepted that a majority of voters would have voted for 1010 put the burden of proof on those who would change in any way what de facto they accepted the voters would have approved?
Thank you, Peter. Greg, let's begin with you on that, about the process for this decision, and give you a chance to address that process, and also address, would it be the thing that you would do again if you had to do it over again?
Oh, there are a lot of things in my life I wouldn't do the same way, but in that particular instance, that's hard to gauge. I mean, there was information that I had available to me based on what I was being told our charter said, and based on what statistically or historically had happened with this kind of vote at the ballot, that I had to look at and say, does this make sense for me to vote this way or this way for the sake of Las Cruces? And when you're talking about how the charter is written and what people were expecting, I think some people really were looking at what Simon mentioned in the documentary about what California does, that somehow when that passed or got that number of signatures, that it was somehow going to just go directly to the ballot or somehow would be stuck at exactly the way it was written. The state of New Mexico doesn't even have that kind of initiative. The state of New Mexico doesn't allow you to bring that sort of thing to the state government.
And of course, as the documentary said, changes could be made, though, to the ordinance whether there was a vote or not.
Correct.
Do you believe now, with all of the controversy about this and a decision still not formally made on amendments, that it would have been a good thing to have a public vote to gauge a broader pulse of the community of what people would have wanted or not wanted?
Well, I think when this first started coming up at our council meetings and when there were articles in the paper, I recognized that this was going to be a very controversial and divisive issue for our community. But I also recognized that we on the council were going to have to take it on and deal with it in as appropriate a way as we could. So as far as how we should have proceeded, there's obviously a lot of diversity as far as the viewpoint of what we should have done. And as far as what I would do again, probably under the same circumstances, I would have had to have assessed it the same way. We were looking at the likelihood that it would pass at the ballot and the fact that if it passed at the ballot, there would be less than 2 months between when it passed at the ballot and when it was put into effect on January 1st. That's a very short time frame. And so in my consideration of that situation, I felt that, okay, given that we're going to be very likely having this come forward, it would be better to go ahead and start assessing it sooner as far as what we ought to do if there were amendments that needed to be made. And I will tell you...
And will amendments need to be made?
That's pretty much the assessment based on some of the issues that came up with the way the document or the ordinance was written.
So you're anticipating that then amendments to be made?
I am anticipating that there will be amendments.
At this point, are you willing to say what those are?
Well, the mayor has put forward something that was in yesterday's city, in the agenda setting meeting, an amendment that he was proposing. And that is public record, so if you want to look it up, it's available. But basically, he was suggesting that the 840 go into effect on January 1st and that it be assessed in some fashion, but that we not include the increases for the subsequent years, so that it would be amended to that point.
So that would be a dramatic change. In other words, there would only be one increase in the minimum wage, the one that occurs in January.
Right, with the possibility of us discussing it later. If I may add, though, one more thing. He also wanted included some of the Fair Trade or Fair Labor Standards Act provisions, which include things like businesses would be exempt if they gross under $500,000 a year, and certain kinds of businesses and that sort of thing. So those are things that we have a back and forth conversation in the community about how appropriate some of those are.
Okay, so Sarah, first question about the vote. What is your contention on this issue? Did you want a vote to occur regardless, or only if the council did not approve the ordinance as written?
Based on our meetings with city councilors and the mayor, it was our belief that it was going to go to the ballot because we did not have the votes to pass it outright.
And that's what you wanted. You wanted it to go to the ballot?
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So
no.
For you, it was simply about getting the ordinance passed.
Right.
So addressing what Greg mentioned here, that there could be significant amendments to this, you're on record saying that that's not acceptable. Correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that is. We think that even though you can do it, doesn't mean you should.
And what in your view is the process from this point forward in terms of deciding what those amendments should be?
So right now, we've always argued that the ordinance that 6,000 people signed, 10% of Las Cruces voters signed, should the heart and core of that ordinance should remain intact, which include in the work session, I think it's going beyond what was discussed at the work session on the 27th, in that it's going from a review in 6 months to now completely eliminating the next 2 years of phase-in.
So what would you like to see, assuming that something like that is something that's being seriously considered by at least 4 members of the city council, what would you like to see before a vote takes place? Would you want to be able to have a meeting of some kind with the council, or?
First, we'd like to have public comment at these city council meetings. I think the longer that this issue has drawn out and remained at City Hall chambers, the less and less we get public input. And so we think that that's a concern, that the limiting of democracy throughout this process. And we know that the mayor sets that. And so I think the other amendments that we're looking at, employers that gross less than $500,000 a year, that's more than half of all businesses in Las Cruces. They're creating loopholes that you could drive a Mack truck through. The second is exempt from paying the city's current minimum wage that will go into effect January 1st, that are beyond the Federal Labor Standards Act. One is workers with disabilities as certified by the state, so that's Trusco. Who is the COO for Trusco? It's Richard Aguilar, who's the head of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Let's look at another exemption, motion picture theaters. That's Allen Theaters. They want to exempt motion picture theaters from the current minimum wage.
Okay, so
that concerns us.
Understandable. We have another person waiting to ask a question, but I want to ask, related to this, a question of you. Assuming that there is not support on the council for these enormous exemptions, is there possibility for small exemptions? So things like not applying the minimum wage to people who are under 18, not applying the minimum wage, the new minimum wage, to employers who have 5 or fewer employees, something like that, as an example.
So I think the other question is how exclusionary do we want our economy to be? And how inclusionary do we want it to be? We wrote this ordinance so that we could include as many workers as possible, and so that it would benefit and be equitable for all workers. Many of the exclusions that the Fair Labor and Standards Act include farm workers or caretakers, and those are very much based in race and gender. And so we wanted to eliminate those biases so that people ultimately could succeed and have opportunity to raise their families and work with dignity.
So it sounds like at this point you are not willing to accept exemptions, period.
We're willing to accept the ordinance as was signed by voters.
Okay, as is. Okay, we have another question, and again, it's Peter from Doña Ana County, right?
It is,
okay.
And I want to follow up on the other Peter from Doña Ana County's question about procedures. As you know, Councilman Smith, I disagree on the law, but aside from how it would come out if we had to test it in court, I'd like to ask really 2 related questions. In your view of the world, what is it that the framers of the city charter thought they were doing when they said, okay, you can do all these signatures and the council can throw it out the next day? And secondly, what do you think that Ms. Nolan and the thousands of people who signed and the people who got them to sign, what would motivate somebody to do that if the city council could do away with it instantly?
Okay, Greg, your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a lot of speculation involved in Peter's question, and frankly, I have to work with the charter, the way it's written and the way that it operates, and I cannot, just as people often try to interpret our United States Constitution, I can't go into the head of somebody who wrote it originally, but I would say that if they had wanted the sort of situation that California has, then I think they would have written it differently. They had that option. They didn't write it that way. And so my assumption is that the city of Las Cruces, the city council of Las Cruces, has that opportunity if they see something coming their way that for whatever reason that the public, 6,000 or 20,000, brought forward and said, we want this for our community, but the city council, which is tasked with making the tough choices for the community, looked at it and said, we can't in good conscience go with that.
Greg,
then the city council would have to be able to make that kind of decision.
Let me ask a follow-up question to that. Do you feel the bar is any higher in terms of maintaining the ordinance because a vote wasn't allowed? By a public vote?
I think that something that has to be considered is the fact that 6,000 people put their names on a petition. And of those people, certain number were disqualified for whatever reason, but most of those people were probably valid voters, even if their name wasn't exactly the way it was on their voter registration.
So you say that should be considered?
Absolutely. The problem that I have with how sometimes this gets taken one direction or another is that there is this presumption that 6,000 people signing their signatures to the petition is the same thing as having said this is the law of Las Cruces. It's not the same thing. It wasn't put to a public vote. It came to the council. It's written into the charter exactly that way. It must come to the council. Only if the council says no does it go to the ballot. And the council considered it, took it under consideration, looked at it, and passed it. It is something that the process worked as far as I'm concerned. The process worked by, we had passed a different ordinance, process brought us something different, we looked at it, we passed the new ordinance. It does not mean that we thought either of them were so perfect they could never be touched, but simply that, okay, we have a new situation here and we'll have to work with it.
Okay. Sarah, as you think about this, and of course we touched on this in the documentary for folks who've been watching since the beginning of the program, if major amendments are made to what your group has worked to get before the council, will your next effort be to work to change the ballot initiative process in Las Cruces to prevent amendments from drastically changing what citizens work to achieve?
Yeah, I think that's going to take a lot of research and checking in with our base of people within CAFé and others.
So it's not an individual making that decision. You're saying it's a group decision. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And I think it does. If our ordinance is drastically changed and altered in any way, I think we're going to have way bigger problems than high poverty in Las Cruces. We're going to have problems that our political and democratic process will be called into question. The integrity of our city government will be called into question, and that's going to be a much bigger issue that we're going to have to deal with, especially going into 2015 municipal elections. I don't see this issue going away. And I actually see, like, how are we strengthening democracy in Las Cruces becoming a theme throughout next year.
Before we go on to the next question, Greg, I want you to take that up because you've already sort of hinted at your concern about this in saying that, you have to look at the fact that thousands of people signed this petition. Knowing that, a lot of folks don't even vote. In this case, we had actually, grassroots democracy, folks going out to get a petition before the council to make change. Are you concerned if that change is drastically altered, the kind of effect that will have on people, how they feel about their local government and about democracy, period?
Well, democratic processes are extremely important in how we operate in this country and certainly in this state and in this community. And when you look at the form of a representative government that we have, that democracy does work. It certainly fails any number of times at one thing or another, and we all, I'm sure, have had our experiences with when something we felt like was righteous or good or appropriate for our community or for our country somehow did not happen the way we thought it should. But I will tell you that one of the things that has been disappointing for me has been the number of times that people have referred to what the political consequences might be for me personally, or what the community consequences might be. And I have to tell you that maybe I'm not cut out to be a career politician, but the point for me is, are we looking at this and assessing it from the standpoint of how beneficial it is for our community and not what it means to our political careers? And so I have to face the fact that in 2015, there may be an organized group trying to keep me from staying in office. I may decide I don't want to run again. I may choose to do something different. But if I choose to run again, I do have to face the fact that, yeah, I may have made a choice or a decision on behalf of this community in my office as a city council member that displeased enough people to keep me out of office. And is that enough for me to change how I vote on the issues? For me, it's not.
Okay, very good, fair enough. Thank you. And we have another question. Your name?
Yes, I'm Jerry Natchison, and I live in Las Cruces, and I'm a registered voter.
Okay, thank you, Jerry.
And I voted. There may be both sides of this, but I'm going to address this to Greg. Based on what you've been saying and talking about the whole community and looking at the process that we've just went through, I'm wondering which part of the community the council is looking at, or is it looking at all of the community? And two, with all this talk of serious amendments, why bother having Article 8 in the city charter? Why have this process when the council can just pass it off as soon as they can?
Okay, so
and
that's
I
really
find that disturbing.
Two questions. Greg, to begin with, the first one, assessing this very important question that elected representatives deal with all the time, and that is special interest versus public interest. And how do you assess what is the public interest? And your thoughts on that, and who was at the table, in a sense, in making these decisions?
Well, that's a difficult thing to assess from the standpoint of who gets more preference. And in my book, It's the whole community. It has to do with what is going to benefit everyone in the community. And certainly we have to look at the people who are working at the low end of that, the working poor, and the people who are living in poverty and can't find jobs at the moment. That has to be part of the equation, and it has always been part of my equation. And so when I look at that, what I have been trying to do, what I've been talking about, Councilor Pedrosa is here and she knows, she's heard me say this, but we are looking at how can we be holistic about this? What can we do that helps the whole community do better economically so that there are the jobs for people to have diversity of opportunities and higher paying jobs? What I struggle with is how we magically say, okay, we raise the minimum wage and all of a sudden everybody can accommodate that. And so that leads to my roundup or finishing comment about that particular question, which is we may mandate a certain minimum wage, but we may find that a lot of our employers are simply not able to pay that. And so a great concern for me, one I've mentioned a number of times, and I think you've heard me say this as well, Jerry, is that I am concerned about the people who will lose their jobs. In addition to, okay, this is great for the people who keep their jobs and they keep the same number of hours and they get paid more, there are the people who will have fewer hours or fewer benefits or who will lose their jobs.
Greg, we're going to run out of time. I want to give Sarah a chance to respond, but his second question, if major amendments are made, does this really kind of negate our current ballot initiative process, that the way it's working really won't be meaningful?
I think it has to be recognized that the ballot initiative, the process that brought this to the council worked up to the point of where it was supposed to. It brought an initiative to the city council. That's what the charter has always said it's supposed to do.
1 minute left. Sarah, your thoughts on this, because these are two really critical issues. Some might argue that they're the central issues in this debate.
So one, I'll answer them in reverse. I think the ballot initiative did work up until where it was supposed to, and now we're looking to see if City Council will work up to where it's supposed to on the issue and see the ordinance through. I think there are some really good improvements that can be made to strengthen enforcement and other issues that Robert Garza, the city manager, has presented. I am unclear about how safely they can get through without getting watered down or other bad amendments getting put in. I think that right now we have to look at, we are a city that is one of the poorest in the country, and that I would argue that it's not, our proposal to raise the minimum wage isn't magic, Mayor Pro-Tem, that it's economics, and that a family cannot lift itself out of poverty on the current wage that we have right now. And that we are looking at something that is reasonable. It goes up to $840 in January, and then $920 the year after that, and $1010. There are some cities that are moving quite rapidly on the issue of minimum wage, and I think that this is a good phase-in. Our first proposal had it going to $1010 by 2016 and eliminating the tipped wage completely. We modified that after talking to businesses. 80% of small businesses in Las Cruces already pay above the minimum wage. Many of them will weather this, and I think that it behooves the chambers in Las Cruces to help those businesses that think that they may not weather it to start planning ahead instead of digging in their heels. I think it's time that that many of us just grow up and look forward at the fact that we need to start rolling this out and preparing our employers and our workers.
Sarah Nolan and Greg Smith, thank you so much for joining us and for continuing this very important dialogue. It's extremely important, and I'm sure we'll have more programs in the future.
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you at home as well for joining us. We want to give a special thank you to all of our KRWG members, because with your support, this station is able to produce in-depth journalism and programs like this that foster dialogue. You can become a member anytime online at krwg.org. Have a great week.